All right, we're ready. Yep. I'll go ahead and get started.
Tina, I'm going to voice, okay?
Great.
Perfect. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Roslyn Kia, and I'm the project coordinator for the Comprehensive Service Center for people who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind. We serve the state's deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind, their families, and the professionals who work with them, whether they are congenital or late onset signers or those who communicate orally from birth to the senior years. If you'd like to learn more, please be sure to indicate it on the evaluation form and I will reach out to you. Or you can find us online at www.csc-hawaii.org. Today's workshop is entitled Hearing Loss Sensitivity Training for Healthcare Providers. It is 2 hours long and will be recorded. We have ASL interpreters and CART or captions available for accessibility. We would like to ask that you please turn off your cameras and microphones, but turn it on if you have a question so that we can see you and the interpreter will interpret for you. If you do not see captions, please click on the CC button on the bottom of your Zoom window. There will be an evaluation link in the chat before we close, and that link also includes a request for a certificate of attendance. We beg all of you to please complete the evaluation as this data helps us to put on more workshops. Our presenter today is Corina Gutierrez, who is currently a Director of Community Advocacy at the State of New Mexico Commission for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Persons. Corina was raised in Hatch, New Mexico, the chili capital of the world, and received her Bachelor of Science degree from Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. So, without further ado, please welcome Corina Gutierrez.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Roz. Good morning, everybody. For me, it's actually afternoon now, so time zone is a little different here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. And Roz, if you need to, you can, I want to be sure that I can see the interpreter well. Can you pin her for me, please?
I'm trying to figure it out.
I want to be sure that I can see the four. I'm not sure if you're able to do is maybe Evelyn could turn her screen off, or Roz, you could stay if you want. The three is okay with me, those three screens. This is okay. What's important is that I can see the interpreter. Right now, I can just see those three, okay? All right, thanks. Excellent, and the interpreter can see me all right. Great, here we go. This is the subject we're getting in today. It's about hearing loss sensitivity training for medical professionals. And we're just focusing on healthcare providers in this presentation because we have so many healthcare providers here in New Mexico that I've worked very closely with in over the years, developing relationships with many of them to understand the difficulties, and I have a wonderful rapport with them. So I'm super thrilled today in order to share this information. I was invited by CSC to share with you in Hawaii what we've learned, and we'll do it through Zoom. I'm super excited about this presentation. And this training is very beneficial for you to learn. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt. You can turn on your screen or just speak out your question or put it into the chat. And Roz, too, if you don't mind, if you happen to see any questions there, you might invite them to open their camera. I might not see their question right away. So help me with monitoring the chat if you wouldn't mind. Great, thank you. All right, so I'm going to dive in. This is who I am. Just want to introduce myself a little bit. I'm Corina Gutierrez. I'm the Director of Community Advocacy there in New Mexico at the Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. Also, I work at the state agency for about 14 years there as well. So Before I was the director, I was also a deaf advocate, and I worked a lot and with many different consumers with communication access issues to make sure that they were able to get access and communication in a variety of places in the same way that hearing people could access things. And then I advanced to becoming a director, and I have less client contact now, but I primarily work on systemic issues and advocacy at that level with healthcare providers, um, law enforcement, the police department, social security offices, human services, various departments at the state and local level in order to prevent those kind of communication barriers that cause communication breakdown. So that in a gist is the kind of work I do. Excellent. I'd like to start by showing you some pictures. Take a look at this one. There's 3 boys and they have boxes that they're standing on. The first one is a tall boy, and he can see the game quite clearly. The second boy is watching the game also, and he can still see relatively enough with his head just over the fence. And then the littlest boy, he can't see at all. His barrier is complete. He can't see at all what's going on in the game in front of him. He might be able to hear it though. And now I'd like to explain how this is relevant to our discussion about sensitivity to deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing communities. In proportion, it's similar to a deaf or hard of hearing or deafblind person, like the short person who at the fence is not able to see what's going on. They don't have the opportunity to see and receive that information. That middle boy is similar to a hard of hearing person who has difficulty getting the information, but maybe gets some due to his hearing loss. It depends about how much loss he has, or whether it happened later in life. Maybe he's getting 50%, maybe 30%, maybe 80%. We don't know exactly, but it's not exactly equivalent to his hearing peers. That littlest boy is like our deaf community or deafblind. The access for deaf and deafblind is very different. We may not have any access to information because we don't hear the sounds at all. We don't hear what's the dialogue or conversation. And so we're well below par on accessing that information. I want you to keep this picture in mind when you think about the real world and the real game and how that applies to what it might be like to have an experience as a deaf, deafblind, or hard of hearing person with loss. The hearing people being able to see easily, hard of hearing maybe struggling more so, and deaf and blind not seeing or hearing and participating at all. The second picture has some accommodations, and this is what it might look like with accommodations. The tall boy doesn't need a box to stand on and give that box to the littler boy, so the littler boy can actually see over the fence, and everybody can watch the game. So what that means in our community when we translate that is that we need to make those adjustments so that we can have access, such as having an interpreter there, or maybe using a cart, somebody being able to read, or having an FM system, a loop system so that students can hear, or a hearing aid. That way the FM is connected to the hearing aid and the student can get information about what the teacher is saying out in the classroom. This is what an accommodated environment might look like pictorially, with the understanding that we have to ask for those accommodations. We have to request the interpreter, that I need an FM system, I need somebody to assist, or will there be a loop system in that particular room? All of these questions are reminders that need to be advocated for in order to get those accommodations provided. It's a constant job in order to keep reminding and getting in the front of those scheduled appointments in order to be sure those accommodations are provided to us. This third photo here, this third picture, is sort of a dream world, ideally. Without the fence that's actually blocking, more of a see-through fence. An accommodated world, architectural changes, like at the airport when I fly on holiday recently. Now they have captions everywhere. I wish there was an interpreter that was there to say, oh, well, the flight was moved to the other gate, and have everything communicated more clearly without my having to ask somebody for some accommodation for specific time and date information that's not otherwise obvious to me. It'd be nice if there was an interpreter already there, or the cart was already set up at the airport, or the loop system was in every room already, so that In a dream world, I wouldn't have to make requests for those kinds of accommodations. We're not there yet, but we're still kind of in that middle space, and we're continuously having to make those adjustments. With the Americans with Disabilities Act passed in 1990, almost 30 years ago now, we're still fighting for the kinds of rights and access and reducing those barriers so that we get the accommodations we need so that the information is accessible. Many people will say, oh, I can't afford it, I can't provide that, we don't have a system for that, can't you bring a friend or family to interpret for you, blah, blah, blah. We hear that repeatedly still, even in this middle environment where accommodations have been provided. And maybe in the 30 years or more from now, hopefully it'll work out so that it's much more smooth and beautifully accessible, that we don't have to make all of those constant requests for accommodations. Let's talk about identity now, what these different people might be like when they identify themselves. What does it mean to you? Maybe tell me in the chat. Feel free to say in the chat, or if you prefer to speak out your response, that's okay too. Just unmute yourself. What is deaf, deafblind, hard of hearing, late deafened, and speech disabled? Silent, quiet group. Does somebody want to talk about what it's like? What is a deaf person? Can somebody tell me what a deaf person might be like? I'll go ahead and give a description. A deaf person cannot hear. They're completely deaf. And there's generally two groups. Deaf people who sign and depend on using American Sign Language every day to communicate. They sign with their hands. And the other group of deaf people who are called oral deaf. Oral meaning they speak, they don't know sign language, and they tend to use amplification like a hearing aid, and they grow up using speech, and they're used to that, and they just depend upon lip reading in order to understand what's going on around them. Secondly is deaf-blind. Anybody want to comment to what deaf-blindness is like? Quiet again. I'll go ahead. Deaf-blindness means a person who cannot hear and they cannot see. And they depend on, it depends on the visual loss. It could be of various grades. They may have some ability to see and they may be completely blind. Some have Usher syndrome where they get more of a tunnel vision after a while and they can only see things far away from the scope. And they don't see anything in that outside field. So if a deaf-blind person can only see down into that small field, then the interpreter who might be communicating with that deaf-blind person must not sit so close. They really need, I would only see their chest or maybe just their face, and I wouldn't see their hands unless they were telescoped much further away, and then I could see their chest and hands and face and head. Folks with Usher syndrome, if you come close, they may only see some parts of your upper body, and that works out well, but you may need to stand a little further back. A person with reduced vision may need tactile signing. They may be completely blind, 100%, and they would use tactile signing entirely. It really depends on the individual and the degree of visual loss and hearing loss and where they are in that range. Hard of hearing is a hearing loss. Sometimes a person may be born with a hearing loss already, and how much hearing loss they have depends on what they discover in that hearing test. It requires that evaluation of how many decibels. Maybe they have 50 decibels, 40, 60, 70, or 80 decibels. For me, as a completely deaf person, my hearing loss is on the right side is 17. That means I'm really profoundly deaf on the right side for sure, and the left is 115 on the left, so less so on the left, 17 on the right, 115 on the left, so a little difference in my audiogram. For hard of hearing, it might be maybe in the 50s or 60s range of decibel. They may have a mild to severe loss. Next is late deafened. That means deafened later for a person who lost their hearing much later in life. For example, senior citizens. They're raised speaking, they hear just fine, and then when they get older, their hearing starts to decline. For those who may be in the military, involved in wartime, where there's lots of bombs and loud noises, there's hearing damage, and that can cause hearing loss later in life and become late deafened. Or teenagers who listen to really loud music all the time, and that heavy bass later on in life can also damage their hearing. Lastly is speech disabled. That means a person who maybe has difficulty with their larynx, not able to speak. It could be from a birth injury or an accident that somehow damaged that part of their larynx. They can see and hear just fine, but they're not able to speak. Okay, everybody following me so far? I could test you now, right? All right, you're quiet. This is a quiet group today. I'd like to talk a little bit about the different kinds of labeling that you'll hear related to hearing loss. I have 3 here. These have been used to label our community: hearing impaired, deaf mute, and deaf and dumb. The last 2, those words are used less and less, but you may still see them occasionally. Deaf mute, like, oh, is that person deaf mute? Or when I see that word, it's really archaic and it reminds me, I really see it less and less now, but occasionally you may still see it used. That first word, hearing impaired, you will see still quite regularly used, frequently, still in the community. However, our community doesn't like that label. When you see the word impaired, that means it implies we need to fix something. But we don't need to fix our ears. We have our own language. We, in generally sign, in American Sign Language, we have our own culture that's attached with that, and our own values inherent in that culture, and everything's intact. It's whole and holistic. It doesn't need to be fixed in that way. It's not broken, but impaired implies broken. And that's a word that was coined by hearing people to describe our community, but we don't use it for ourselves. I wish we had been included in that discussion about what kind of nomenclature to use and what was appropriate, and have a longer discussion about that so that we were a part of that discussion rather than the hearing community deciding for us. But we had to educate the outer community not to use those kinds of labels for us. And when they use these 3 labels, it's inherently not accepted by our community. Our preference is to use these words here in the caps: hard of hearing, deaf, lowercase deaf, and speech disabled. You'll know that there's an uppercase deaf and a lowercase deaf. The capital D deaf implies those deaf people who use American Sign Language and sign within the deaf community. They go to the deaf school, they have a deaf family. They don't have to have a deaf family necessarily. But like for myself, I come from a hearing family. They speak Spanish. I don't speak Spanish, but because I grew up in a deaf school here in New Mexico, and after I graduated and went to Gallaudet University, I was the only deaf liberal arts, which is the only liberal arts university in the United States, and I was able to interact with many deaf students at the college level there, involved with a strong deaf culture, and I call myself Big D deaf, capital D deaf. The lowercase d deaf is for people who have a hearing loss later in life. Maybe their first language is a spoken language of English or some other language, and they don't know our language or our culture or our norms. They're not really involved in our community, and so they call themselves deaf with a lowercase d. And so I'm encouraging you to please use these yellow words that are more appropriately used in our community. Don't use hearing impaired, deaf mute, or deaf and dumb. Hearing impaired, again, implies that we're broken and we need to be fixed. Don't try to fix us. We're satisfied and happy with our identity and who we are. I am. I'm proud to be a deaf person, a woman, and I'm Mexicana. I'm proud of who I am. That's my identity. I'd like to talk now about language. I know that the Spanish word here we use in Mexico. Well, it's pretty predominantly used. I know in Hawaii you have a whole litany of other languages you use there, which would be a longer discussion. But for now, I'll just use this comparison between English and Spanish to give you the idea with American Sign Language in order to help you understand the differences. You can see here, in English, you might say, I have a red car. It's already set up with the English rules. It follows English structure. It's in the right order with the verb, noun, and adjectives. It follows all the rules that have been set up for hundreds of years for English. Now with the Spanish, tengo un coche rojo. Okay. Again, that is in Spanish, following Spanish rules with the grammatical structure and words in the appropriate order. Now, what that might look like in American Sign Language is this: red car, mi have. You might think, ooh, maybe that's broken English. That sounds awful, but no, it actually is following a written structure. American Sign Language is not written, but it has its own structure. It's been researched. It's not a written language, it's a visual language. And it's how we express ourselves in ASL. And it also has its own rules for structure, word usage, and grammar and lexicon in the signs. So I'm going to emphasize for you now that maybe if there's not an interpreter there at a meeting that you have in any particular situation, and that for some reason the accommodation has not been provided, and you find yourself writing back and forth with a deaf person, don't judge their English as broken English. They're using an American Sign Language version of a spoken version of or a written version of American Sign Language. It's not generally written, but there are some people that don't read and write well in English. From 0 to 3rd grade, they may not have had a lot of input for reading and writing skills. And so then writing will come out more as they're writing back and forth with you, following that ASL grammar. If you wrote an English sentence and then gave it to a deaf person, they might understand most of it, but not some of the more heavily laden words or large jargon. They're used to ASL in their everyday usage, which has a different kind of word choice, and so they may sometimes struggle with your larger word choices. So it depends where they came from. If their first language was ASL, then I just want to emphasize that you may see that if you're writing back and forth with an ASL user. Let me take a look at the chat for a second. In reading the chat, I see Evelina said that it's almost like PSE in Hawaii, Pidgin. And what about their education level? Does that make a difference? Does Pidgin imply that a person has a lower education? Remember what I said about the reading and writing skills of it depends on who that individual is and what their reading and writing skills may provide a struggle to them because they've grown up without accommodations or may not have accommodations there. If an interpreter is there and they understand everything that's happening, I'll explain a little bit more about interpreters later, but I wanted you to understand how to make it a person might feel more comfortable with the interpreter there because they're speaking their native language, and the meeting will go much more smoothly. Now I'd like to talk about deaf behavior. How to get our attention appropriately. In our culture, we tend to get people's attention by just waving gently here in the air, like, hey, oh, until the person looks at us and we have eye contact. You just get their attention by waving. But I want to emphasize that when you're waving, don't wave right in front of their face. That's super annoying, and it's a boundary issue. It's a violation of a boundary to get that close to somebody's face. Secondly, where you touch them could be on the shoulder appropriately, like a tap here on the shoulder to get their attention. If they don't see your wave, you can tap them gently, appropriately, and the area that's appropriate is right here, not on the head, never on the top, never on the back and smack somebody. It's fear inducing. If I don't know or see somebody behind me, if they touch softly on my shoulder, don't smack, but just gently touch or tap the shoulder. Don't hit the leg, don't smack the knee or the belly or the rib cage. It's not appropriate, only right here on a shoulder. A table can be used in, say, a classroom, for example, where the teacher is trying to get a student or group's attention, might tap gently on the table just to create a vibration that then the students are alerted to look up and the teacher has their attention. In the medical arena or the medical setting, you may have a deaf person at a table for a consultation, and you could tap gently, or even at a bedside table. They're not going to feel something that's too far away from them, but they would otherwise feel you tap on their shoulder. You might also just briefly flicker the light, just once or twice, not like a million times, but just flick it. 1, 2, open, off, on, off, on. That's enough to get somebody's attention, and they'll look to see who's arrived. Next, sometimes a doctor will ask a question and a deaf person will give a very elaborate answer. They'll get started into that in a way that's more culturally appropriate for them. Oh, I see that there's, I wanted to ask somebody to close their screen, please. Okay, great. Joanne,
Yes.
Can you unmute? Ah, good, thank you. Do you mind closing your video so that I can see just me and the interpreter while I'm sharing my screen?
You bet.
Oh, thank you. Excellent, thank you. Okay, so I wanted to talk about when the doctor asks a question, and the deaf person tends to elaborate at length, and they may go all the way to the end before they finally answer yes or no to the question. The reason they give that elaboration is because the way we grow up, generally in the deaf community, like myself, growing up in a hearing family, I didn't have a great deal of communication. I was desperate for that ability to share my internal experience. So if somebody asks me something, I'll tell them beginning to end what the answer is, and then give the yes. So it's important for them to know about me and my life and my experience before I give a yes or no. And that's generally how a deaf person may answer. So it's important that you're patient and you listen to that when you're working with the deaf community. Excellent. Thirdly, facial expressions. I use facial expressions as part of my ASL culture. It's part of our language. We use facial expressions all the time. You might wonder that it's rude, but actually it's part of our culture and part of our language. For example, let me show you something. When I say I'm happy, oh, hey, how are you? And I use my face like this. Or if I was angry, why are you late? Right? You see the difference? I've been waiting and waiting and waiting for you. See, my face is different. I'm scowling in the second one when I'm mad, or I'm happy, my eyebrows go up. My whole body and my caricature is different. And it's included in the language. It's part of the actual grammar and the culture too. Really, it's very parallel to your voice intonation, right? You get excited, your tone goes up and your inflection goes up. And when you're angry, your voice might get low or high or deeper. Oh, Mike, drone along. I don't care. I'm apathetic. So you imbue a lot in your tone, just like we do through our facial expressions. It's super important that you don't take it personal. They're not being rude, like, my God, why are they doing all that movement? It's part of the language. Excellent. Let me tell you about the deaf nod. It happens everywhere around the world, I think. Many people, hearing people think that deaf nod means they understand. Oh, yeah, I get it. Oh, sure, sure, sure. But that's not really what that means at all. It just means that they're giving that nonverbal feedback, like, oh, okay, oh, huh. They may not really understand. It may really be going completely over their head. They're not quite caught up what you're talking about. They haven't learned to advocate for themselves or express a question And so it's important for you to ask, oh, okay, so then do you understand? And what I just said, do you have any questions about that? And if there are misunderstandings, you could check for that to be sure that they actually understand. So be patient in checking for understanding. You might have to repeat something or expand further for clarification. Now I want to talk about large, fast gesturing and signing. If a person is under a great deal of stress, maybe they just got some bad news, you just got cancer, and they're very upset, they're completely stressed, and they don't know, oh my God, how did I get this cancer? I don't know. Does that mean that they're really mad at you? No, they're just expressing themselves, and it's coming out in that larger physical way. They may be under stress or maybe shocked. They're not out of control, even though their signing might get larger. It doesn't mean they're going to explode and run out of the room. It just means maybe they've gotten some really rough news about cancer diagnosis or something, and they're expressing their feelings. These are some general communication strategies for working with a deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind population. It's really important for a hard of hearing person in particular to know what the subject is. What are we talking about? And then get into talking about it. If the person is relying on lip reading, and they need to have the subject first, and then they'll be able to understand, like, oh, we're talking about your thyroid, or we're talking about this issue. Then you can eliminate the words that look like thyroid in your guesswork in your lip reading. So it helps a hard of hearing person to communicate and read better when they're reading your lips if they know the subject. A hard of hearing person who uses a hearing aid in these days, right, with COVID lately, I noticed that hard of hearing people are super frustrated because everybody's wearing masks and we're distanced, so the hearing aids don't pick up the sound as well. It's more muffled. It's not able to amplify, and they're really challenged for following along. I'm seeing that a lot here in New Mexico. Super challenging in Hawaii, I'm sure too. And we need more sensitivity about that, about how can we make some communication accommodations in these times for deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf providers. Is deaf and blind. With the providers, are we able to use some other kinds of accommodations like voice to text at the same time that helps when a person is speaking to help show in a live format the captioning? That might help to support the communication. So think about using that voice to text on your phone to help be more constructive in your concerns about how to meet the accommodations for deaf and hard of hearing, particularly hard of hearing in that case. And also to speak clearly. Don't yell. You don't have to exaggerate word or word like this. No, just that. Don't hurt your voice and strain your throat, or make your mouth really huge. Just speak slowly, clearly, normally, in a flat or regular tone. You see two different photos here, two different pictures down below. The one on the left has noise in the background with a fan, and the one on, you're going to have a difficult time hearing things, or if they're amplifying the noise with a hearing aid, or there's people in the background talking. You're trying to have a one-on-one conversation. Be in a quiet room if you can, especially with a person who's hard of hearing that's relying on the amplification. Anytime a hard of hearing person may not ask you to move into a separate room. They may tell you that they can't hear in that environment. And if they don't express that, you may have to help advocate for them. Say, are you able to hear well in here? Or, gee, it seems awfully loud. Let's go into the other room. It might be better for you to hear me in there. So help them to advocate for themselves in those settings. The second picture, you see a person standing with a really bright background behind them. If I was looking at that person, I would not be able to see the interpreter signing. If that was my interpreter, I would only see them in silhouette. So think about the lighting in the background. The interpreter needs to move such that the lighting is on them or towards their face, as if you would for a photo. So you don't want to stand the interpreter right in front of a bright window. interpreters often advocate for our community and let you know as health providers where we may need to stand or where it's best to have that kind of visual communication before you proceed. If you want to talk with a patient and try to explain their medical situation and you've tried it again in the same sentence that you used, you've already repeated yourself but still seem not to be getting understanding, then rephrase what you're saying in a way with other words in order to help expand and get clarity. The use of body language, facial expressions, and visual aids will help your communication. If something doesn't seem clear, like you're talking about a shoulder injury or a tendon tear, what is a tendon? For if the person doesn't know what a tendon is and you have a shoulder model that you can show, you can point to the tendon. You can pull it out and say, oh, look, this is where the tendon is and this is where it's torn on yours. And it helps them to visualize what you're talking about. Oh, that's a tendon there. Oh, I didn't realize. And help them to understand what your plan for treatment is and to clarify, oh, you have a tendon tear right here, and what we're gonna do in surgery is to sew it up. They may just nod as if they understand, but they may not truly understand. And when you show them, they'll say, oh, well, why do I need to have surgery? I thought we had already talked about the tendon. And so if you can explain the tendon tear in a visual way and the surgery that you're planning to do, those visual aids are incredibly helpful for communication. Thirdly, I spoke a little bit already about the environment. It would be helpful for communication to have a proper lighting, a quiet environment, and reducing visual noise. Not too much stuff on the wall, too many things to look at, too many people milling around, children running amok, too much visual noise. Hearing people can kind of tune that out, but a deaf person visually cannot. So make sure that the environment is quiet, that it's visually appealing or pleasing and conducive for kind of visual communication. Just checking in with my interpreter. Okay, great. Also, just want to encourage you to be really patient and positive and relaxed. If you come in all stressed, then it kind of feeds into that. So if they get upset, just try to understand that they're communicating their feelings and needs. Oh, I see something here in this chat I want to look at. Yeah, I see what Jan has mentioned here in the chat. She said it's super important to use facial expressions, especially when a hearing person is trying to speak in ASL or use ASL. If they don't use facial expressions, then what they do say and sign in American Sign Language could be misinterpreted. I got it. I see. She wanted to rephrase it. So a person who's learning ASL, I got it. Yes, it's important to add in those facial expressions. Many times a hearing person who's just learning sign language, they're super excited, and I understand their excitement because and they come up and they say, I can help. And a deaf person's like, oh, I see, you're signing a little bit. And then when it's my turn to respond and I say a bunch of stuff, they're like, they're lost. They have no idea what I've just signed to them. So be careful. I'm fine with people being excited about being new signers, but don't do it during work time when I'm, trying to access information. Do it more on a personal level or outside in the lobby, or if you see somebody. It's fine if you want to introduce to me in the store or something and say, I know just a little wee bit of sign. I just know a little bit of sign, and then be patient with me. And then as a deaf person, we'll chat. I'm an ASL instructor, so I enjoy that interaction, and I know how to teach at level 1. So I know the excitement and the fear and the strain and the overwhelm and the shyness about meeting a deaf person that hearing people go through at that level and how they feel. So it's important. I know sometimes as you get into it, the signing that you don't understand. And so then it'll be your obligation in a conversation to explain what you don't get in sign. And then Jan said that her husband, that her son is hard of hearing. And sometimes that happens where the misinterpretation happens. The son misinterprets it, and then she laughs at the both of them for the communication breakdown. Yeah, and be careful with your facial expressions. The reason why I say that is because sometimes deaf and people will see hearing people that look like this, roll their eyes because they're really impatient with us. And ooh, of course we feel offended, like, oh, why did you just roll your eyes at me? And they just are rude with their body posture or what they say. And it creates doubt within a deaf person. Like, did I do something wrong? And remember, we've experienced depression our whole lives often. We're not in the hearing world at that same level of your experience. We may not be able to hear what's happening. And so there's doubt about what caused that. Was that about me, or did you hear something else in the room that I didn't hear? And so it creates that kind of uncertainty within a deaf, blind, or hard of hearing person when they see your body language is curt or annoyed. Wait to roll your eyes until after they've left, especially if it's not an issue relevant to me, so that I may understand and not have a miscommunication. Thirdly, don't say the word nothing, never mind, it's not important. When we're in the hearing world, lots of people we may ask, oh, what did they say? And then the answer is, meh, not important. But it's important to us if we can't hear it. If you're working with a patient, let's say, and there's no interpreter there, and you're like, oh, wait a minute, and you drop it and leave, I'm like, what? Wait a minute, where'd you go? What's going on? Will I have an interpreter for my appointment? I'm just standing there waiting without a clue, like, hello? And you just walk off. Like, I might have to look for somebody else to help me and ask, what happened there? She just left. Is she ignoring me? I don't know. So don't leave a person just standing. Right back and forth. Let them know the interpreter's not here. The interpreter's coming. Do you want to keep your appointment? Do you want to reschedule? Give and ask and empower. Don't just leave them standing outside, abandoned, wondering what's going on. Again, so take the time to communicate. Write if you need to. If the interpreter's there, that's great. Be patient working with the interpreter, with the deaf, blind, or hard of hearing person. So take that time. And I already said not to ignore or avoid that interaction. Get face-to-face, one-on-one. Explain what's going on and be genuine. We're humans just like you. I just can't hear.
Sorry, just getting the technology right. The interpreter needed her microphone on. So now we're going to talk about when speaking and speech reading tips. When you're working with a hard of hearing group, make sure that your face is clear at that time. I know there's a lot of mask wearing at the moment, but it's really hard to even speech read without a mask on, or if you're having gum, candy, cigar, mustaches, those that protrude around the lips make it very difficult for a hard of hearing person to read your lips. And then a mask, of course, is much challenging. So we really emphasize that voice to text can help to communicate with hard of hearing people, writing back and forth. Voice to text app, there are several different ones that are free apps that you can use. I'm just reading the message. Try to use a clear mask if you can. Would that be helpful? Yes, definitely would be. Yes, if you could wear a clear mask. I know that one healthcare provider here that they have researched and worked together and gotten clear masks for any any person, not really related to coronavirus. Like you can't do it obviously with that, but in general use, if it's not coronavirus related, you can wear a clear mask to be helpful for deaf and hard of hearing people so that they can see and communicate better with you. Yeah. Okay. Also too, as we mentioned, when there's too much visual noise going on, you struggle, and just noise in general, that can be distracting. If it's one-on-one talking with in person, please don't like move your head side to side because they depend on reading your lips. So as you move your head side to side, they can't see that. I know oftentimes I see when I go to a doctor's appointment, the doctors would like, I look at the interpreter, so that's easier for me because I'm deaf. But if I'm working with a hard of hearing patient, sometimes it's important that, you keep that eye contact and then you do your typing and your information on your computer. And then you look back at the client and then back at the computer. But if you turn and keep speaking while you're looking at the computer, they won't understand you. Yeah, I already mentioned this about the excessive facial hair, that it makes it all but impossible to read. If it's very well trimmed and everything like that, that's all right. That's okay. And then make sure that the light is good as well. Because people would have a hard time seeing you if it's a darker room. Make sure it's brighter. All right, now words of caution. So I'll just put up that paragraph. Only approximately 30 to 35% of the English language is visible on the lips, making the remaining 65 to 70% effective as a guessing game. So that's really an interesting fact. So imagine for hard of hearing groups, for the deaf people, for me, for example, I'm only getting 1 or 2%. So, like the ones I can get are the ones that are commonly said, like, can you read lips? Like, I understand, like people ask me that almost every day. Can you read lips? I understand that sentence, but my answer is no. Because if I said yes, then they'll just keep on talking at a normal pace and I would be lost. So I'm not in this 30 to 35% group. I'm in a 1 to 2% group that I'm just missing everything. So emphasize for the hard of hearing group, and talking about them, they might need, just like fewer words, like more like the important words related to the topic to make sure that they're on topic here. So there's a lip reading exercise. And I'm going to, I've got 3 words here. And so the interpreter is going to say the directions, but then you guys are going to have to try to lip read what I'm saying. And type it in the chat what you think I'm saying, okay? Just want to make sure. So I'll do the first word, no interpretation. So the interpreter will say this word without voice, and look at the interpreter. If you're ready, watch the interpreter. She's going to mouth this word. I'll do it again. So what word is that? Ray said the word baby. Yep, very good. Second word. Which word was that? I'll do it again. Anyone guess that word? Just throw out anything. Just someone put it out. Babe? No, no. Maybe. Maybe. Yep. Roz says maybe. Roz, shh. Yes, that word was maybe. Now the third word. And we'll do it again. Can you guess the third word? Just any word out there. Payment, no. Name, no. The answer is pay me. Pay me. So if you see those three words, baby, maybe, and pay me, they look the same. So that when you find hard of hearing people, they are guessing, is it this word or this phrase? Which is it? And so, you saw that some people thought, oh, it was this word, some was that one. So imagine going to a store, you're like, how much is that? Oh, it's $10.50, or is it $10.15? Like it's hard to know. Is it 50, 15? So you get out 15 cents and like, oh, no, it's more. Okay, that is 50. So that can be difficult to read lips in those scenarios. So for the hard of hearing group that, please do not ask a deaf person there if they read lips, because it will not be effective. Writing back and forth. If you don't have an interpreter, or especially when on arrival, just write it down. Say the interpreter will be here soon, and just give them that piece of paper. And then, or if you don't have that interpreter, just, write it, but don't assume that they can read your lips. So I want to talk about working with a sign language interpreter. So I'm curious, effective communication, what that means to you. So hopefully people, please just start answering in the chat, please. So how about going back to those words, I saw the comment that all look similar. Baby, maybe, and pay me. Yes, that's correct. They do. They all look similar. So now to effective communication, what do you think that means? Anybody? You can speak or type in the chat, whichever. Silence. All right, well, effective communication, right? Sorry, I saw somebody has typed some things. Ray has commented, yeah. Communicating in a way that's cognizant for the other patient. Convey a message that is understandable. Understand what is being said and to clearly express yourself. Great, thank you for those comments, thank you. So it's really important that both people understand each other, that the one person understands the other. That's effective communication. Simple. Oftentimes though, the hearing person and the deaf person are in there. They say, oh, you don't need an interpreter. We'll just write back and forth. And the other person is, remember that ASL is their first language. Their reading, writing skills, we don't know what that might be. And they might struggle to write or to express themselves into English. They might assume that they know what you mean. And then the whole miscommunication can then occur. So that's not effective communication. So saying, oh, no, it's not important. Say, no, I don't understand. It's like, all right, hold on. Yeah, maybe we can change this and provide a different scenario where we can communicate effectively and better. So interpreters, to have skilled interpreters, qualified interpreters, they can interpret effectively and accurately and impartially, both receptively and expressively, using necessary specialized vocabulary. So interpreters, some are more focused on legal work and know more about legal vocabulary. Some work in the K through 12 system. Others might be more medically specialized. And so the person who, the interpreter that might be coming to the school system, already is well versed with the knowledge of how things work, but it would be inappropriate to be put into a court situation, because that is not effective communication in that situation. That's not possible. So they have to know what their specialty is and the experience that they have had and which areas that they have had experience in. So if they are qualified, that's good, but make sure it's qualified for the scenario that you are hiring them for. And also I teach my deaf community too, that what does qualified mean? And I explain to them in effective communication what that means. That's for our community here to learn. I do a training for them. I teach too in the deaf community in Hawaii as well, what that means. So interpreters who have gone to a 4-year college and got a 4-year degree, and have also done an interpreter training program for a couple of years and graduated and got a degree. Also, they've taken the test through the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, got a national certificate. And they might also have additional specialized interpreting documents as well for medical and mental health or legal. Licensure, I know that New Mexico has a state licensure for interpreters. They require the interpreters to have a state license, but in Hawaii it is not required. So you can get a license to interpret in that way, but they also need to have continuing education and follow the Code of Professional Conduct and HIPAA as well that they follow. So there's a lot of things that they're required to do in our communities as well, in the hearing communities, that we trust and know that the interpreters are following these, that have these qualifications and follow these professional standards. I'll show you a Hawaii certificate, what it looks like. As I said, Hawaii does not have a license for interpreters. Here you notice that it's a quality assurance system here. We encourage our deaf community to ask the interpreters if they have an ID or a qualification card, Hawaii card or an RID card, and we tell them, ask and have them show that they are qualified and they are certified and they are an effective interpreter. I don't know if the deaf people here in Hawaii do that, but I don't know if the interpreters, if they have that to show them, but I do encourage my local community to ask for qualification and proof of it. So now we'll do ER considerations. There's a really big issue that I see here in New Mexico, as well as all over the country, using VRI, video remote interpreting. You're using VRI. Do you use that, I think, here at some of your locations? Do you have it? Have you used it? Yeah. Evelyn said, yes, I used it one. And then Ray said you used it once on Oahu. I used it on Maui. VRI is becoming more and more popular all over the country, which is great, but I want to explain a little bit more about that part later. But now I'll talk more about ER considerations. So when a deaf people, when they show up in the ER, they usually I'll explain more issues why, they don't like VRI, but I want to talk more about what happens when they arrive to communicate. I think it's good to start with VRI, absolutely, but realize that to bring an on-site interpreter as soon as possible. And the reason for that is because our local interpreters already know the deaf community and know their signing style, and they can communicate more easily and more effectively with those people. Than VRI, you might get somebody like in whatever company you use, they might be, I'll talk a little bit more about that, about a VRI company in Hawaii, but for here in New Mexico, when I click on it, our ASL is slightly different than other states. Our signing is different. So some interpreters don't know our New Mexican signs. And so when the VRI company uses different interpreters, that might be from New York, for example, or an interpreter from another state, and they don't understand our signing and our ASL. So they have a hard time understanding. And sometimes people, they don't understand a word completely, and then they don't know what the sign is, and they don't know how to spell the word in English. So it causes a lot of communication. As a deaf person in the interpreter, we just aren't connecting, and the communication isn't effective. And the interpreter's like, well, oh my gosh, the two of you just going back and forth, and I'm left out. So you can use VRI for a short term, but I would say to bring an on-site interpreter as soon as possible so that you can get the clear communication and see what happens. All right. So and then once you get the on-site interpreter, that's better. Medication. Now, more and more interpreters are becoming certified with medical knowledge. But if you don't have someone like that, like medications and medical words are quite big and quite confusing. I know I saw one interpreter once, she spelled the medication word and she just kind of like stopped spelling it at the end and just moved her hand, meaning like blah, because she didn't know how to spell it. So for medication, it is better to write it down, even if you hand it to the interpreter, or even for the interpreter to see, so that he or she can then spell it correctly for the deaf person. Visual aids as well are really important. They show what the person's issues that they have, problems that they are having, the signs, and explaining clearly, but it might be overwhelming getting all the information at once. And like, what is my problem? What are the issues? What I should and shouldn't do? If you have visual aids, that really helps people say, oh, okay, this is what you can do. And that's really helpful.
Excellent. I'm looking at the chat now. Evelina mentioned about, she had said many of the deaf on Maui prefer having a live interpreter versus VRI, and they express mixed feelings, that they prefer interpreters from Hawaii. Yeah, yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that too. Yeah. Yeah, let's talk a little more about working with an interpreter. To you, you're working with a deaf patient, right? And the interpreter's to your side. Please don't look at the interpreter. Look at the deaf person. Have your conversation with them. The interpreter's just sort of a feed of the information between the two of you. I understand it is going to be odd though, because when you're looking at them, they're not going to be looking at you when they sign, right? So when you speak, right, the deaf person won't be looking at you. They'll be looking at the interpreter over your shoulder, and that might feel odd. You might feel like, hey, look at me, but that's why they keep averting their gaze is to look at the interpreter. And when the deaf person is then expressing themselves in sign, they may look directly back at you. And then when you speak, they may look back at the interpreter. So that may feel a little bit awkward, but get accustomed to that. It's a very common hearing complaint, like when they tell the interpreter or when they're talking to the person, they often, hearing people will say, tell her or tell him. Forget that you're talking to an interpreter. Just pretend that they're out of the conversation and say, I'm talking to you. I'm going to talk to you about your treatment and care. Don't say, tell them or tell him or her that I'm going to. Interpreters will say what you say. So if you say, tell him, tell her, the interpreter is going to keep trying to say that too. And it'll really make things in a confusion. So oftentimes the interpreter is like, what do you mean? Tell her, tell him. Of course I'm going to tell him or her. That's why I'm here. So just get into your instruction. And I try to explain that so that people understand. Some people will not tell you, but some interpreters are like, oh, okay, it was still say, would you mind please just speaking directly to the deaf person and not to me? They may tell you, but they may not. Just know that it's an extra step for an interpreter to have to go through that. Don't say tell him or tell her. Just speak to the deaf person. And the interpreter will interpret. Thirdly, interpreters might provide information regarding language. Yeah. It's important to get involved. They don't get involved in your language or discussion. It's just between the two of you. The interpreter is out of it. They basically are neutral, a neutral party just interpreting the conversation and dialogue between the two of you to look and watch and explain, but otherwise not participate. They might provide information about environmental or language related information, but not chatting and being involved in the life of your consumer. When I'm signing, you may see as I'm signing, the interpreter may have a delay. Well, actually, let me see how I want to say this. I want to make sure that the interpreter is speaking here. Hold on. Okay, yeah, they can hear you. I just wanted to check the audio. I want to make sure that you understand that the interpreter is only going to make brief comments. Make sure that you have enough room to finish your conversation and not to be intrusive. They'll let you finish what you're talking about. Secondly, here, when I'm signing and I'm done saying what I want to say, the interpreter is still talking. There's a bit of a lag, right? She's catching up with me. Because ASL and the English language are completely different. So it's pretty amazing. I might be done signing in the visual language, but the spoken language really has to finish processing in the language, in the brain, what she saw in her eyes and switch it to a manual language. And there's a lot of work involved in that to make sure that there's the correct selection of words and signs. As I applaud that work. Oftentimes the interpreter will tell me as a signer, hold on just a second, I need just a moment to catch up. And then when she's done speaking, I can continue with my dialogue. Like here in my presentation, I'm watching the interpreter to give me cues. When she's done speaking, sometimes I have to wait for her. And once she gives me the go ahead, then I can move along. Thirdly, I'm not sure in Hawaii, but here in New Mexico, we work with the ambulance service. And when the ambulance arrives, a deaf patient who is coming from home needed to be brought in by ambulance may have told through the dispatch that this is a deaf person that's being brought into the hospital. And that's a reminder for you to get the interpreter and try to get them there as soon as possible. In Hawaii, I'm not sure exactly what the system, how it operates, but I'm sure it's pretty similar to try to get the interpreter as soon as possible when they find that they are bringing a deaf person in the ambulance in an emergency status, that hopefully the interpreter could be there as soon as possible. Now I get to get deeper into that discussion about VRI and tell you a little more about what that is. I'll show you a picture here on the screen, what it kind of looks like. The first picture is not blurry, right? Or a little bit blurry, right? So it's a little blurry in that physical, that it's sort of a bandwidth weakness. It shows when you see a picture like that on your video screen with an interpreter, it's a bandwidth problem. I see this all the time. Whenever I'm advocating for my client consumers, I go and I see this in various service providers that are trying to use VRI. I said, the VR, when they say it has to be VRI, I said, well, let me see what it looks like. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so blurry. The bandwidth is too weak. The Wi-Fi is awful. There's somehow no Ethernet cable connecting so if the Wi-Fi is weak and we're seeing this kind of picture, communication is not going to be successful for sure, because it's freezing up, glitching. I can't see the interpreter. Maybe the audio is okay and you think things are going well because you're just talking into the computer, but I'm not getting anything. So I have to ask them to say over again what is going on. So I'm emphasizing now in communication. If you see me struggling to see this frozen screen, you might need to check in and see that I'm not understanding and the communication is not successful. Don't force us to use this when it's not actually working, right? It's glitchy. It doesn't make sense. I'm not going to get anything, right? That means the interpreter can't see me either. I'm freezing up. She's trying to figure out what I'm saying, and we don't have communication between me and the interpreter. And the second one says, please wait, and it's buffering. Trying to connect. Trying to use some VRI system, that company is just not answering and you're waiting. It's unsuccessful. It's frustrating for us. We see this buffering and we're like, I've been told many times, this is why many people don't want to use VRI. And they'd rather have a sign language interpreter, but many providers require, you must use VRI. And then this is what we get. You try to log in and nothing happens. I took time off from work to go to my medical appointment and I'm sitting here and this computer doesn't work. I've wasted my time. I'm losing I've lost time. And I took time off, maybe 2 hours taken from my paycheck. It's a waste of my time standing here just to have failed communication when you could have had a sign language interpreter there and we'd got down to business within if I was sick, it would have been worth my time to take sick leave. My time is valuable too. It goes both ways. Not just if you provide this and it doesn't work and you say, oh, I'm so sorry, we can make the appointment and we'll just write back and forth. I'm like, really? This is based on, now you're going to put this on my literacy writing skills? That's not fair. My communication is not going to be successful with you. So this third picture, you made a connection, but the plug doesn't actually come together at all. Somehow you just struggle in the hardware, like the VRI system just doesn't even work at all. I've had that all over the place as well. I've seen this a number of times where you press the button and it just doesn't work. Like the battery is dead. And they're like, oh, sorry, we forgot the charger. I'm like, oh, sorry, we forgot the cord. Or I'm like, well, great. Now what are we going to do? Oh, reschedule again? I took time off from work. My goodness. So it's not fair. So give consideration to that when you're thinking about our community and the impact of that. Fourthly, sound, right? If you might see the interpreter just fine, but the hearing person's like, what? I can't hear them. There's no sound. And the deaf person's like, oh, it's not working. And so then again, you're struggling for the hearing end. I've actually been the assistant, the tech support for the nurse, trying to fix the iPad and touch things to finally get the speaker to work because they didn't know how to use it, but I've used it so many, I know how to navigate a little bit more. And she's like, oh, I said, well, your internet is weak or lousy, or I tell them what's the issue, that your audio is not working, or, and so I end up having to get into that in an advocacy capacity. But here again is a fourth scenario where the audio just doesn't work. In the first picture, two men, a doctor and a patient, are sitting face to face. This is really like the normal scenario, right? The doctor will be using VRI in a situation like this, where the VRI is facing the doctor, where he's speaking, and the deaf person can't see the screen. They're like, hello, you need to turn the laptop around. You don't need to see you. They need to see me. They can hear you from anywhere in the room. So that happens often, where the orientation of the VRI system is like, no, it's not on you. It should be on me. It's not for you. It's for me to see and communicate visually with them. So let's turn the VRI in a way that makes sense. The interpreter, when you know you're going to use a VRI in a doctor scenario, make sure that they can see the interpreter. You can hear just fine, and they can hear you in any orientation. You can see that the deaf person can see the interpreter right over the doctor's shoulder in that first picture. The second picture has it has a mobile phone, and the lower one has a landline phone. Let's see, the doctor decided to hang up. You know, we're done. He hung up, and the patient wasn't finished. Like, whoa, I had questions. Hey, why did you hang up the VRI and take off? I'm not done. So that's happened. Don't hang up the VRI. Ask and recommend. Ask to the deaf person, do you have any other questions before we hang up? Is it all right to go ahead and hang up now? And they say, no, I have one more question. Oh, yeah, I just thought of something. Or give them a moment to think and actually wait and be patient to allow them to think and formulate a question before you go ahead and confirm that they're ready to hang up. I know hearing people have the hearing privilege that we don't. So please be considerate of your privilege. Be considerate of our experience and ask if there's anything we need. If we have questions, give us a moment to think and ask if we're ready to hang up. Don't decide for us that everything's ready to shut down and shut that appointment down. Okay, ask us. I want to talk a little bit about this, and I'm not sure whether you have it there. Oh, let me read what's something here in the chat. Oh, there's a comment here from Jan. Maybe you can see that comment there. It's frustrating that since my son's been 19, I've been trying to help him to be independent, but it's just, okay, he doesn't really quite understand what the providers have said in those appointments. And the providers are unable to provide him an interpreter. And so I end up having to flex my time from work in order to support him. And I'm not as fluent in ASL as I'd like to be. That's from Jan. Well, unfortunately for Hawaii, you don't have state licensure for interpreters to get a license. Here in New Mexico, all the interpreters must be licensed to interpret. If the person was not a licensed person and you went ahead to have them interpret, you could get in trouble. You could get sued for using somebody without a license. So that's through the state licensing board. The licensing board could decide and penalize the doctor or fine them from even up to jail time, up to a year. So we teach our community and we tell them far and wide that if a family, if you have a deaf child in your family, don't step in to interpret, because even if they refuse to provide interpreters, we'll advocate for you and teach those professionals, because otherwise they also could get in trouble for that. And things have improved greatly because people have learned. I think it's been like 5 different healthcare provider conferences I've done. The first 2 already then have set up staff interpreters positions at their agencies. The third one are really working hard at that now, and the last 2 are trying to work on that, figuring out how to do that. but working out positions as for an ASL interpreter, it really has been very successful to have that, to set up a position, and then things run much more smoothly. It's not just for ASL interpreting, it's Spanish interpreting. We have here Indian, Native, and Navajo Indian language interpreters. So a variety of language. We have a strong Vietnamese community here in New Mexico. And so we're able to get a contract position. It's because then it's more affordable, but we're able to, because we use them so frequently, we were able to create a small position like that. Hawaii has that, but it's a great idea to set up a position there that helps to manage these issues with an ASL interpreter. And I just wanted to point that out here. There's a large healthcare provider that many of them use MARTY. It's called MARTTY. It's a VRI. It's a type of abbreviation for VRI, and I understand that they are requiring to use VRI, and it really just touches me that it's there in such a way because it's set up that it's sensitive to my language. Maybe in the Hawaii community, they feel like me. I'm deaf. I sign. I want to use my first language, and many hearing people have made decisions about what is best for accommodations for me, for our community. And wow, excuse me, but VRI is not effective 100% of the time. It's not. And we want to be able to have ASL interpreters because we were just talking about regional signs, right? Hawaii interpreters, local interpreters already know the local signs for things and vernacular in the area. Our deaf community in Hawaii there, or in a variety of places, wherever, places of the country or other places around the world, Japan, where there's a native or culturally embedded aspect to the sign language is so various depending on where you come from that it requires that rapport and a style of use of language, like interpreters from the mainland who go to interpret from the mainland are not often aware of regional signs. They don't know the local vernacular and sign and what a deaf person who might actually sign in that area and to be understood in Hawaii. A mainland interpreter may struggle. I know often there are those misinterpretations. They don't understand what it means, so they throw that word out and it really means something, but they decide to say something else to try to fix things. But then there's these fragments in the communication. And you as a healthcare provider might think, oh, everything's going smoothly, right? There's an interpreter and you think everything's going well. The interpreter may still not be understanding because they don't understand the local signs that your deaf consumer is using. That really, really aggravates me. That I really discourage you from using this MARTY system because it doesn't have the sensitivity of those local language nuances. And so I ask you to get an interpreter whenever possible to make sure that the communication is much closer to that 100% effectiveness. It's not about you. It's really about the deaf consumer. It's their life and health and survival. It's my medical information. If I have to use a VRI interpreter from the mainland and they don't understand what I'm saying, forget it. I go home, I go down, go home, I shut down, I'm aggravated with somebody else. I don't know how to advocate. Maybe people don't know how to advocate for themselves. So I just want to emphasize and think about the impact and what are the needs of the consumer in front of you. Do they need an interpreter? Which one do they need to use? Can they use VRI? But most of them will prefer an on-site interpreter. So get one whenever you can. I really want you to be considerate, compassionate, understanding, empathic for their experience and their needs. What accommodations do they need? Not just what you can provide. It's about them and what they need, not just what you want or what you have.
All right, so sort of the last thing before the question and answer session, one more thing to ponder. A deaf person who is a caregiver, and they're a caregiver for hearing parents, and they go with the patients because the hearing parents need medical attention. The deaf caregiver doesn't need the attention, but they are caregiving for the parents. So the question is then, do you still provide an interpreter for the caregiver? Jan says yes. Ray says yes. Thank you. Yes, under the ADA. Yes. Yes. Someone else said yes. Yes. So under the Americans with Disabilities Act, it is your responsibility to for the consumer who is deaf, to provide for the consumer who is deaf, whether they are the caregiver or the patient. Realize too, to clarify, and something else to consider, a deaf parent with a hearing child who come in. The hearing child needs the medical attention. And yes, you provide the interpreter for the parents. So, and a third scenario, this is the interpreter. Cannot see anybody. I don't know if you can still hear me.
I've gone ahead. We'll go ahead. So you may have a deaf parent or a deaf patient who's gone in from some medical attention, and they have a hearing child, right? There's no interpreter, and they say, oh, we'll just use the child. Oh, please never use the child, the hearing child of a deaf parent or adult to interpret, please. Great. So I'm finished with my presentation, and I'm glad if you want to open up your cameras now. I know a few of you are here that I know. If you'd like to connect, please go ahead and open your cameras now, and we can get into our Q&A. Hi, everybody. Let me see who's here. Good, good. Would you like to make some comments about Hawaii, about the healthcare providers here? Do you have any questions, Jan, that you'd like to discuss?
Right now, not at the moment. I'm still learning how to help my son with getting the services he needs as he transitions from high school to college and even in the work field, because he still wants to be a nurse. So I'm getting to know his VR counselor. I'm trying to get the hang of knowing the resources here in Maui, although it's very, very, very limited here. But I have learned from managing cases with patients who are deaf, especially in the neighbor islands. A lot of doctors are not as accommodating to the deaf and hard of hearing community. I've even requested to see if they could just use like a clear mask so the patients could at least read lips or even write down what the visit's going to be about. And I find it very difficult to collaborate that with the providers.
you also want to comment, Colin? I see what she just said. Yeah, we often experience a lot of that pushback here too from the medical providers relevant to asking for a sign language interpreter. We often get that. And what we do in that case is then we refer the people to Hawaii Civil Rights Commission. And that's where they can file a complaint. And once that process gets going, it's okay, but it may take a long time. It could take up to 6 months. But change policies and practices and procedures, and sometimes even penalize them financially, sometimes. And those are the only real options available if you feel like you don't have a good experience and you've experienced discrimination. And at our agency, we don't have an enforcement authority. We encourage the volunteers to follow up and file an ADA complaint. We can't force them, though. It's the Civil Rights Commission who can actually force them to make the change. I'd like to add to that, Corina said, she's saying we have an advocate too that we work with in a variety of ways. What we tend to do is do observations with that healthcare provider and then file complaints, and then the information then can be used from those complaints. If the care is very serious and neglect, then we go to the National Association for the Deaf, who have attorneys who can work with medical issues that or the healthcare provider access issues. If they're not willing to provide those accommodations through the ADA, it can be enforced. And the NAD is very powerful. If interpreters or any accommodations are not being provided, then you can work with the NAD, which is at nad.org. And for private practice relevant to the medical profession, we tend to have a licensed board with New Mexico that finds out that information. If we need to, we can file a complaint with them, and they'll investigate and research about why the doctor's not providing that kind of access or accommodation in general for blind people, folks using wheelchairs that need that kind of access. We filed with the Department of Justice as well in that case, and we've worked with them to file complaints when necessary here. So if that's the case in your area, you have some opportunities. If the doctors are not providing that, then follow that escalation of steps in agencies available.
Oh, did that help answer your question? So Ray, did you have a comment, Ray?
Yes, please. Hi, my name is Ray. I'm a nurse practitioner student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So part of my project for my capstone is I want to develop simulations for nurse practitioner students as well as RN students. And I want to touch bases on patients who have disabilities such as hard of hearing and blindness. Do you have any preference or ideas of a simulation that you think that I should focus on?
Colin, here I think a lot related to Corina's talk about VRI. One of our agency's most common complaint is from the use of VRI. So anyway, the ADA, they have a minimum performance standard for VRI, and often that is not met. To include what Corina had explained about people dropping out or the patients like not being lit properly or misuse of it. But most common reason though is dialect, is what she mentioned, was dialect. And so, you know, unfortunately, often the hospitals, they have a contract with a national service provider, not a local service provider. So meaning that hospitals will use this national pool of interpreters, meaning that the chance of a deaf person actually getting an interpreter who understands them, like for like in Corina's example in New Mexico or here in Hawaii, you know, and then they get this person they can't understand. So it is really better to use a local agency. So a good example for a scenario like you said is maybe set up a deaf person come in and use VRI, and they don't want to use the VRI. What do you do? You know, that could be an example.
Thank you very much. And also one more thing. I know you touched base on apps that providers can use. Are there any top apps that you prefer that I can also share with the NP students as well as the RN students as well? Because I know in the clinic setting, I do come across some patients who are hard of hearing. And unfortunately, those clinics, they don't have access to VRIs or interpreters. And majority of the time I'm writing things down. And I know you were saying, you know, sometimes ASL is a patient's first language and writing is their second language. So if you could recommend an app that I can
just to clarify, a deaf or hard of hearing groups, they are different. So a deaf person uses ASL as their first language. A hard of hearing person might speak English as their first language. So sometimes writing is an effective communication for a hard of hearing person. But if they're already speaking, then they can speak to you sometimes. But then when you respond, they're like, what? They don't quite understand. Then I would suggest a voice to text app so that you can speak and it makes text to them. And so then that way that can flow more quickly and smoothly. I've seen a lot of people say, you know, please bring your phone with you and we use your phone. And to me, I'm like, no, don't ask us to bring our phones. You know, you can rely on your iPads or technologies that you have, you know, use those to communicate with us, you know, if you're communicating with us. A hard of hearing person, say, no, don't ask them to use their phone. No, it's your responsibility as a provider to provide the equipment. But go to the best app to use is Google live stream. I'll share it here. I'll get the exact name. Google Live Transcribe. Oh, sorry. I was gonna try to show it to you, but I use that. It's a live transcribe. Like with meetings with Zoom, I have the interpreter, but I also have this too ready. So if there's something I want to review or something, I can. So it's very effective. And it's not 100% accurate, but it is one of the better options out there of voice to text app. So I would suggest that, the Google Live Transcribe. But please don't ask the person to provide it. You know, please have it on an iPad or a device that you bring.
Thank you very much.
Also, another one, Colin is adding an app that you can use for texting back and forth. Big Note, Cardzilla, Make It Big. There's some other ones that are good for texting that's different than speech, but yeah, Corina's saying I use that Make It Big to communicate with hearing people at stores. If I have questions about something, I can just text that and then they can speak into it and we go back and forth that way. So I use that. But for medical appointments, I would suggest the live transcribe. And also too, if you pick up a prescription, like that's all you need to do, it's good to do that texting back and forth. So any more questions? You know, we got Colin here, which is great. And he's from Hawaii. So, you know, I'm not. So, you know, I do go often, yes, to Hawaii, but so thanks for joining today, Colin.
I have a question, Corina. So would these also help those that, I have a couple of clients that is not able to speak. And some of them are elderly, so using text, you know, has been difficult. Are there other communication, you know, access to communication for those that are elderly? You know, we're looking at the senior groups. They lost, you know, their hard of hearing, and they have also lost their, you know, they're not able to speak.
Okay, so they can't speak, meaning like they are speech
So
disabled?
they developed, so they have their hard of hearing, and they, you know, they lost their voice either through cancer, and you know, so they're looking for communication.
Yeah,
and
so
they
there's
don't do
two things.
text.
Yeah, there's two things. They've lost their voice and their hearing. So for the like losing their hearing, our agency, we have like a communication equipment program for hard of hearing and speech disabled people. And we have different technologies for them, like for using like amplified phones or using like FM system, like a system where like it amplifies to them. Like they have a tool set up that connects to them. So when they meet with people, providers or whatever, they can speak. And if it's in a group, they put it on a table so they can hear everyone's conversation. And so that connects to that, like to the sound that's happening around them. So that, you know, that way, you know, the fan noise and things like that, you know, that can interfere with it. But if they have this one little piece that's on there, it sort of connects with the people pretty well. But speech disabled, we have like equipment for that, like, I can't remember it exactly. It's a long word. I'm not sure exactly how to say it. A larynx, something, but it's a speech thing that if it really helps. It's really interesting equipment. I'm not sure if Hawaii has that available, but it's if you have an equipment program. Do you have an equipment program in Hawaii? For hard of hearing people,
Yeah.
for patients.
Yeah,
It's usually
I have another person just with a speech disabled, but his hearing is good.
Mm-hmm. So you were saying, Ross?
So at the CSC, one of the things that we do is we have an iPad with a keyboard set up on our desk, so that when someone comes in who would like to communicate that way, then it's ready for them. All of our staff have either an iPad or a laptop there at the computer as well, and they just use iMessage back and forth. But it gives the person the ability to just type right then and there, as opposed to like whipping out their phone or something like that. But we've also found with some of the senior citizens, they prefer to just write. So they'll write their part of it, and then the other person will respond back either by typing or by using an amplification device, depending on what the senior citizen prefers to receive that information in. But I think it's really important to just think low tech, like, you know, how do we want to communicate with this person to make sure that it is as simple as possible, especially for our seniors who can get flustered with too much technology. So if they're okay just writing back and forth, then that's what we try to do with them. And whether it's writing big or if they prefer to have us speak, then we'll speak back our response and then they'll write theirs or they'll type theirs. But giving them some of those options and then just finding out what works best for them, that's something that we do.
Yes, I have other equipment too. It's pretty basic. It's called, have you heard of it? It's UBI-DUO. Have you seen that one before? UBI-DUO? It's a device. It's there's like two people and it's a really simple device. It's a very small equipment. I know, I don't know if senior citizens would feel comfortable using it, but a lot of hard of hearing people really like to use the UBI-DUO system. UBI-DUO system. The system is really cool. It's communicate back and forth, and it makes it easier for them. And some people buy that equipment to use for hard of hearing people. Social Security office uses that often for their hard of hearing clients. More questions? Or just comments? Brian.
Yes, aloha, Corina. Thank you so much for your presentation. It had so much wonderful information. I'm dyslexic. I have trouble taking notes, and I was wondering if you could share your PowerPoint. Was one question that I had. The other question.
Oh no, I don't really use PowerPoint. It's our state stuff. I can't share them.
Oh,
state,
okay. No problem.
Proprietary.
No problem. On one of the slides you talked about proper language usage, nomenclature, and you said that for people who didn't speak, you called them speech disabled. And my understanding was that in ASL, the word disabled means broken. And I was wondering why you chose to use speech disabled, or why it's not just a non-speaking individual or something along those lines.
That's a good question.
Okay.
Oh gosh, you stumped me there.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Colin, do you have? I don't know. I have to research that myself. Why that is the case. I know that's just the word I've seen used by everybody. So I don't know. I don't know if it's politically correct to use that word. Maybe I don't know.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah, I will have to check on that. Yeah, Colin's saying too, part of it has to do with the words used under the ADA. So that if you read the Americans with Disability Act, it gives you a, it's the rules on effective communication. So you see in there, people are blind, deaf, have a vision loss, people who are hard of hearing and blind, people with speech disabilities, so people who are speech disabled. So it's in the wording of the ADA. So maybe that they need to update that terminology. I don't know, but it's on the policy level anyway. So, I mean, you bring up a good point that there might be a more politically correct or less ableism way to speak about a person.
Mahalo. Thank you.
All right, other questions or comments? If not, we can close this discussion.
Corina, this is Nani. I know that we'll be having more training coming up. That's awesome. This is a very wonderful presentation. And I know that there have been questions from the medical sector when it comes to paying for the interpreter. And I know there are a lot of questions because of the different charges they might receive, and they don't understand. So I'm really great that I've hooked up with CSC, with Roz, and then with Colin, and they'll be doing more presentations. And for Maui especially, we're getting information to our islands finally, and hopefully this will get out into our communities. And so in our medical sector, there'll be more if they have any questions. So this is really great, a wonderful training. Thank you so much.
Yes, well, thank you too for inviting me to come and give this presentation. I really appreciate it, and I'm happy to do it for your community. And plus as well, it's great to see everybody and Colin, a familiar face.
One last question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Sorry. One last question. Yeah.
One last question. And this was from one of my deaf friends. He asked, will insurance, medical insurance, ever pay for interpreter services? Good question.
Yeah, Colin. Well, sometimes they will, sometimes, but the ADA does not clarify who. They say the service provider, so the healthcare provider is responsible for the cost. If the patient's insurance will cover, that's great. But if not, it means that, sorry, too bad, the health insurance or the provider needs to provide an interpreter. Yeah, here in New Mexico, the insurance companies, it's not their responsibility. I know everyone likes to, pass that on, but yeah, they've been really struggling with that, so I don't know. It seems to be better now here in New Mexico, but it is certainly not perfect yet. So we're in the process of making it improve. Colin is saying that one challenge that we have and we've seen is that some insurance companies, like Medicare, for example, they will cover it. But once payment happens, the doctors, like they think, oh, we don't need to. They're like, no, it only applies for that one. It's case by case basis. So it's each, provide people who are providing a service. Sometimes it's the office, but sometimes they can pass it on to an insurance company. So it depends. And Corina is saying too, for a deaf person, for someone, I'm on the committee for healthcare providers, advisory committee for healthcare advisors. And I'm on 2 different healthcare providers committees, working with them to teach them more and learn more about this sort of talk, that sometimes they don't realize, what these issues that these people have. So for example, like I work with discrimination often and try to fix it fast. And that's really key, that happens with this community. And so one person, it's really improved communication access for them. All right, anything more? Ross, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Corina, for presenting today. I'd also like to thank Nani Watanabe. She's a program coordinator and disability specialist for persons with disabilities at the Maui Economic Opportunity, and also Colin Whitehead, who is an ADA specialist from the Disability and Communication Access Board, for supporting this event and working with the CSC to provide more of these types of workshops. We're very grateful. There is an evaluation link in the chat. Completing this evaluation link helps us a lot, because this is how we get our data for our reporting. And in doing so, we are able to then hit up our higher ups and say, can we have more workshops, please? It was successful. So it would be very beneficial. If you can see Nani's nodding, yes, please fill that out. That would be very helpful for us. But I think that's it. So when you fill out the evaluation, you can also request a certificate of attendance. Thank you so much to Corina for presenting today. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for making this an incredible
Thank you everyone for
presentation
joining in.
available to Hawaii. This is not something that we've had before. So thank you so much. And that's it. Thank you so much,
Thank you,
guys. Have a
Roz.
fantastic week.
Thank you,
Bye.
Roz.
You're welcome. Bye. Thanks,
All right,
Gina and Regina.
Thank you.
And
Hi,
Sammy.
Colin.